welcome to my coronavirus classroom. I'm Janessa Jacobs, and this is Heart, Day 2. So, whoa, sorry there, Alex. We left off yesterday talking about the similarities and differences between cardiac and skeletal muscle, and you may have wondered why. And the reason is that you already understand skeletal muscle and skeletal muscle contraction. You already understand how neurons work. So we can use that understanding and build on it and change it a little bit, tweak it a little bit, so that we can understand how our different types of cells are working in the heart. So the similarities and differences that I want to talk about today in skeletal and cardiac muscle are in the ways that they contract. So if we think about skeletal muscle cells, they are sitting at a resting membrane potential of -90 millivolts, and the stimulus to contract them is an action potential coming from a lower motor neuron. It's going to stimulate this end plate potential to develop due to acetylcholine binding. The actual action potential that's going along the surface of the cell is going to be conducted along the sarcolemma and down the T-tubules. And ultimately what's going to happen then is we're going to open up these voltage-gated calcium channels inside the cell and release calcium that was stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum out into the sarcoplasm. So calcium will go up, and then we can have our cross-bridge cycle occur, and muscle contraction will occur. So if we think about all of the anatomical structures that led to these events, then the action potential was being conducted due to this normal, fast, voltage-gated sodium channel. And if we think about the behavior of that channel, it opens at threshold, which is -55 millivolts, and when it opens, sodium rushes into the cell to +30 millivolts, which is sodium's equilibrium potential. At +30 millivolts, the voltage-gated sodium channel closes and inactivates and enters an absolute refractory period, during which time there's nothing we can do to open that channel. So what we said could happen in neurons, dang it. Okay. So sodium is going to rush into +30 millivolts, and then we will see that the voltage-gated potassium channel takes over, and so this is just a normal voltage-gated potassium channel. Its behavior is that it also opens at threshold, but we can't see its effect until this closes at +30. So what I like to say is that it takes over at +30 millivolts, and this is going to repolarize these cells. Okay, we know that. It's this depolarizing swing of the action potential that's going to open up these voltage-gated calcium channels that's going to allow for our cross-bridge cycle to occur. Okay, good deal. So, stimulus coming from a lower motor neuron, depolarizing our cell. Here we're summing up, not really summing up, we're getting our end plate potential developing, triggering our action potential, which is just like an action potential is. So these cardiac muscle cells sit at -90 millivolts, and the stimulus for their generation of an action potential isn't going to be a neuron, just in a normal moment-to-moment basis. So the autonomic nervous system can make adjustments, that's true. But when you're just sitting there and your resting heart rate is just going along beating, that's coming from these cells in your heart that are part of what's called the heart's intrinsic conduction system. That's what we're going to talk about in a minute. But those cells are not neurons, they're nodal cells. So that's going to be a difference. The stimulus for these cells is coming from our autorhythmic cells, which I tend to call nodal cells because it's easier to write. So that's another name that works for them. Sometimes you'll see that they're also called pacemaker cells. Auto, self, rhythm, they're self-rhythm generating. And so those cells behave a little like neurons, and we're going to talk about them in a minute. Right now what we're trying to do is understand how our cardiac muscle cells behave a little like skeletal muscles. So if you remember last class, we said that in skeletal muscles we could develop tetany, which was the ability to just like build tension and fuse a contraction. and so that we could get a lot of tension out of a muscle. You're not going to be able to do that in your cardiac muscle, and that's because we want to build tension, but then we want to relax so that we can contract and relax, contract and relax, contract and relax. And the way that we can do that is to create a really long absolute refractory period in these cells, during which time that voltage-gated sodium channel cannot be opened again, so that we can repolarize the cell before we do anything. Now sure, there's going to be a relative refractory period and we can increase heart rate. The sympathetic nervous system does that. There are chemicals that can do that. We'll talk about that at the end of lecture, but right now we're just trying to understand what do these cells look like. Okay, they have got our normal fast voltage-gated sodium channels. If you want to know what it does, I'll sum it up again really quickly, but I'm not going to write it again. It opens at threshold, which is negative 55 millivolts. Sodium rushes into the cell, depolarizing the cell to positive 30 millivolts. It's equilibrium potential, and then that is going to close the channel. It's going to inactivate. We're going to enter an absolute refractory period. During that time, then, the difference here is that after we get up to our 30 millivolts depolarization, then we're actually going to open these slow voltage-gated calcium channels. So let's just actually imagine this action potential on a graph real quick. So we're sitting down here at negative 90 millivolts, and all of a sudden we just get hit by this stimulus from these autorhythmic cells. It's going to open our fast voltage-gated sodium channels. We don't have to do any kind of summation. These bad boys open up, and we rush in until positive 30 millivolts. So that's what's going to happen through this channel. But then we've got these slow voltage-gated calcium channels in the membrane. So they're slow voltage-gated calcium channels. And when they open, calcium is going to start coming into the cell. And calcium comes in, it's a cation with 2 positive charges for each one. So it's going to bring in some positive charge, and it's going to create this plateau in the action potential. So this is a plateau in the action potential, and that's going to be a difference between these cells. We don't have a plateau in the action potential here. What we're doing here, though, is we're keeping this plateau in the action potential so that we get this really long absolute refractory period, so that we can definitely start to repolarize these cells, relax, and then allow for the pumping of blood. So what's going to cause the repolarizing now? Well, the repolarizing now is going to come from this normal voltage-gated potassium channel that just repolarizes cells. So after a few milliseconds, this slow voltage-gated calcium channel is going to close, and our voltage-gated potassium channel is going to open. Potassium is going to exit the cell and repolarize it. Okay, so we'll see that potassium exits the cell and we repolarize the cell. But this channel is going to open in response to the 0 millivolts that will be coming from these cells. So it opens at 0 millivolts from the noble cells. Sodium is going to rush in to positive 30 millivolts. Then the voltage-gated sodium channel is going to close and inactivate. Our slow voltage-gated calcium channel is going to open, and calcium enters. Now this calcium is going to actually do 2 things. It's going to, number 1, create the plateau. So it creates the plateau phase. And again, that plateau is going to keep our voltage-gated sodium channels absolutely refractory for a long time. Enough time to start repolarizing so that we make sure that we can depolarize and contract and repolarize so that we can do it again and pump blood. So the other thing this calcium entering these cells is going to do is help with that cross-bridge cycling. So that's another difference between cardiac and skeletal muscle. In skeletal muscle, the only source of calcium was the calcium that was stored in our sarcoplasmic reticulum. So in our cardiac muscle cells, we do have intracellular stored calcium. We've got sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it's just not as abundant. We don't have the terminal cisterns and the triads and things because we don't have these big long muscle fibers. So we do have some intracellular calcium, but this calcium that's coming from the extracellular space is also going to help with cross-bridge formation. So the other thing that we could say when this channel opens is that this calcium entry is going to allow, or it's going to help with cross-bridge formation. Or with cross-bridge cycling. Why? Because it's going to bind to troponin and move the tropomyosin complex and release the inhibitory interaction with actin so that myosin can reach up and grab it, and we can go through cross-bridge cycling. Okay? So let's just go ahead and write that down then. That another difference between these two is that in skeletal muscle, the calcium for contraction is only intracellular, is only the stuff that's stored intracellularly. In cardiac muscle, our calcium is stored intracellularly in the SR, but it's also coming from the extracellular fluid. Okay, so setting the basic rhythm. How are we going to set the basic rhythm in these autorhythmic cells so that we can get these to contract and conduct their action potentials in that fashion that I just drew so that they can do this tension curve that's going to allow them to contract and relax, contract and relax, contract and relax. That's what we're talking about. Now, the cells in the intrinsic conduction system behave a little bit like neurons. They're going to be the cells that are generating the impulse that's going to stimulate our contractile cells so that they can generate their action potential that's going to lead to the events of getting our calcium out so that we can do all that stuff. You know all that stuff, cross-bridge cycle, rewind. Go back to last semester. I don't know what to tell you. So, if you recall, neurons are sitting at a resting membrane potential of around -70 millivolts. And we're going to sum up our postsynaptic potentials to try to get to thresholds so that we can open up our voltage-gated sodium channel. I don't really want to go through a review of last semester stuff. I just want to compare it. So if you recall, then once we got there to the threshold, we opened up those voltage-gated sodium channels, we depolarized to positive 30 millivolts, and then we repolarized due to our voltage-gated potassium channel, which brought us back down, hyperpolarizing, whatever. Okay, so the important thing is that we've got this depolarizing swing due to our fast voltage-gated sodium channel, and in that, what's happening through this fast voltage-gated sodium channel is that it is opening at threshold, which is -55 millivolts. Sodium is rushing in to positive 30 millivolts, and then this channel wasn't activating. At positive 30 millivolts, we became inactive, entered an absolute refractory period that lasted until right around when we reset near around resting membrane potential again. So this whole repolarizing swing was due to our voltage-gated potassium channel. And it opens at threshold, and it takes over when our sodium channel inactivates, and potassium rushes out to its equilibrium potential, which is -90 millivolts. So if you recall, that hyperpolarized our neurons, and so then we had this relative refractory period here. And this whole time when we were resetting, this was our absolute refractory period, and it was kind of relatively short in neurons compared to what the absolute refractory period is like in our cardiac muscle cells. That's a long absolute refractory period in that action potential, and that's what's going to allow those muscle cells to generate tension and then relax, so that by really not being able to build and build and build more tension, we can have efficient pumping of blood. Okay, so in our nodal cells, or our autorhythmic cells, these are going to be our pacemaker cells that we find in this intrinsic conduction system. So what kind of channels do they have that are different? And then I'll talk about where we find them all. If we look, these actually our trickle voltage gated sodium channel. And these cells are sitting at a resting membrane potential of -60 millivolts. And so when they're at rest, sodium just kind of trickles in. So just trickles in. So through these, sodium trickles in. And it's going to trickle in until we get to threshold. But what's interesting is this time it's not threshold for our fast voltage gated sodium channel to depolarize the cell. This time it's threshold for a fast voltage gated calcium channel. And so the threshold for this channel is -40 millivolts. So if we were to draw this thing up here as a graph and try and compare the action potential in these cells, then they're sitting here at rest at -60 millivolts. And what happens is our slow voltage gated sodium channel is going to allow sodium just to trickle in until we hit -40 millivolts. So here at -40 millivolts, this is the threshold for our fast voltage gated calcium channel. And when it opens, then we're going to depolarize the cell up to about 0 millivolts. So I should have drawn that higher up. So here at 0 millivolts, calcium is going to rush in. So here our calcium is depolarizing us to about 0 millivolts. And then our voltage gated potassium channel, which I never think is too horribly interesting, is going to take over, and potassium is going to exit the cell. So potassium is going to repolarize us like we always do, bring us back to rest. So potassium opens at threshold, but it's going to take over when our voltage gated calcium channel closes, and it's going to repolarize. So we could say potassium repolarizes us to rest. And now, when we get back to rest, these slow trickle channels are going to take back over. Sodium's going to slowly trickle into the cell. We can see it happening under here, disturbing this figure. It's about to erase it. But sodium's going to slowly trickle into the cell. At -40 millivolts, our fast voltage gated calcium channel opens, depolarizes us to about 0 millivolts. Then our voltage gated potassium channel takes over, repolarizes us. And when we get back to rest, our pacemaker cells are going to set the pace because our sodium trickle channel is gonna take over. Sodium's gonna trickle in, and on and on and on. So a couple things happen. Let's write down some words. Is Alex in the way? Yeah. All right, I'm going to write down the words over here. Looks like you can see since my PowerPoint disappeared. Gotta love the technological difficulties. Okay, so what can we say about the action potential in our nodal cells? So the action potential in our nodal cells, which again are all the cells in our intrinsic conduction system. What's going to happen? We can say that they have a resting membrane potential of -60 millivolts, and when they're at rest, they've got a slow trickle of sodium into the cell, again through this slow voltage gated sodium channel. Sodium trickles in until -40 millivolts. Then our fast voltage gated calcium channel opens and depolarizes the cell to about 0 millivolts. Now this 0 millivolts is going to do a couple things. It's going to stimulate the next cell down the line in the conduction system, which we're about to talk about, and it's going to be the impulse that starts the action potential in our contractile cells. So if you recall just a slide ago, I showed you the graph for their action potential and they were sitting there at -90 and then all of a sudden just jumped up to +30. What made them just jump up to +30? The 0 millivolts did. So let's write that down. So at 0 millivolts, the 0 millivolts is going to, number 1, conduct the impulse to the next nodal cell. And number 2, it's going to stimulate contraction of our myocardiocytes. Okay, the action potential in the nodal cells. They're sitting there at resting membrane potential of -60 millivolts. There's a slow trickle of sodium into the cell. It creates this pacemaker potential. So that's what this little like trickle in here is. This is the pacemaker potential. And sodium's going to trickle in until -40 millivolts when our fast voltage-gated calcium channels are going to open. And so calcium is going to depolarize the cell to about 0 millivolts. This is going to conduct the impulse down the conduction system, and then it's also going to initiate the action potential in our myocardiocytes. Okay, so that is how the cells behave electrically. We'll talk about that again in a minute, but I just want to show you the structures of the conduction system, and then we'll kind of bring it all together for how it's working. So the SA node is the first part of the conduction system, and this stands for sinoatrial node. And from the SA node, which is located up here, it's the sinoatrial node. From the SA node, our impulse is going to be conducted to the atrioventricular node, which is right there, the AV node. And then from the AV node, then our impulse is going to be conducted through this part of the conduction system called the AV bundle or atrioventricular bundle or the bundle of His. And that is all insulated by that fibrous skeleton of the heart we talked about the other day. And then from there, we're going to go from the AV bundle through the right and left bundle branches. And all of those are also insulated by the fibrous skeleton of the heart. And why might that be? Well, because if you look, our great vessels that are leaving the heart are superior up here by the base of the heart. So we want to insulate all throughout here so that we don't stimulate contraction of our ventricular myocardiocytes until we get down here. So when you get down here to the apex of the heart, now when we come into these structures here called Purkinje fibers or the subendocardial conducting network, then those are not insulated. And if you can see, they go this way up the walls of the ventricular myocardium, which means that when they conduct their impulse, we will contract from the apex toward the base and contract and push all of that blood up and out of the heart. So, all right. So our AV bundle is the atrioventricular bundle, also sometimes called the bundle of His, which is spelled His but with a capital H. And then it goes down our right and left bundle branches into the subendocardial conducting network is what newer books are calling it, but they're also called the Purkinje fibers. Okay, so if this was a heart, then it would be a wonky looking heart, but whatever, we're going with it. Let's say that then this would be the interatrial septum, this would be the interventricular septum. This is my right and left atrium, right and left ventricle. Okay, so right up here is my SA node. Here's my AV node. Then I'm going to go to my AV bundle, and from there I'm going to go down my right and left bundle branches. These structures are insulated by the fibrous skeleton of the heart, and then from there I'm going to go up my Purkinje fibers. And so if we stop and think about this for a moment, what's happening? Well, I didn't tell you all of everything. So the impulses here generated by those pacemaker cells are those action potentials that I just talked about in a different outfit. Yeah. And so these cells are going to fire. They're going to have that trickle in of sodium from 60 to -40, and then calcium channels are going to open and depolarize the cell to about 0, and then potassium channels are going to take over and repolarize the cell to 60. So that 0 is going to do a couple things. Here, it's going to, at the SA node, it's going to conduct this action potential down to the AV node, but also it's going to spread through the atrial myocardiocytes so that they can generate an action potential. And if you recall, those are the cells that are sitting there at -90. And then there was no kind of summation that happened in them. They just jumped up to +30 because of the 0 millivolts from these cells. So what happens with this impulse is it goes from the SA node and stimulates the atrial myocardium, and then it goes to the AV node, pauses for a minute so that they can finish contracting and relaxing, and then it's conducted through the rest of the conducting system. When it gets down here to the Purkinje fibers that aren't insulated now, it'll stimulate contraction of the ventricular myocardiocytes. And so then they're going to contract and relax, and we're going to move blood through the heart. So if we want to think about the sequence of excitation, we could think about the impulse here. This impulse does two things. It stimulates our atrial myocardiocytes. Stimulates them to do what? To generate their own action potential. And then it's going to conduct down to the AV node. So that'll be the second thing it does, is it's going to conduct onward to the AV node, which without it could generate its own signal. We're not going to worry about that in this class. So all of these cells kind of behave in this spontaneously depolarizing way. They just do it kind of slower and slower. The SA node is actually faster than your resting heart rate. The AV node is slower. It slows it down to your resting heart rate, so that the average of those two is what your resting heart rate is. Yeah, so all of the cells in this system can generate impulses, but the further that you get away kind of from here, the harder it is. So the impulses they generate aren't fast enough to do pumping of blood. So let's see, what else we want to say? So then the impulse is going to kind of pause here. So first we're going to stimulate our atrial myocardiocytes, then we're going to be conducted to the AV node. At the AV node we pause for a moment due to fewer gap junctions between the cells. And what that's going to do is allow for full relaxation of our atrial myocardiocytes. This is going to, the impulse is then going to be conducted through our AV bundle and our bundle branches, which are insulated. And then here, when we get to our subendocardial conducting network, this action potential is going to, the action potential in these cells is going to stimulate our ventricular myocardiocytes. From the apex to the base, so that we can push blood up and out of the heart. Okay, so the heart sets its own pace because of those nodal cells, but the autonomic nervous system can regulate it based on what's going on in the environment. So if you're just sitting here at rest, then your SA node, then your conduction system is setting your resting heart rate. But let's say a burglar comes in the room, and you get all scared, then your sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in, and through the cardioacceleratory system, we will increase heart rate. Where in the brain is the cardioacceleratory system? Medulla oblongata, right? So that's where our cardioregulatory system is. So our cardioacceleratory respiratory system is, and our cardioinhibitory system, the instructions coming down to our heart are originating there. These are part of the cardiovascular system or the cardioregulatory system and the medulla oblongata. And the cardioacceleratory system is going to increase your heart rate, and it's going to do so by increasing the firing of potentials going to the SA and AV nodes. From our medulla oblongata then, we're going to send information down our preganglionic and postganglionic axons that are coming from our thoracic nerves, and these are going to increase heart rate at the SA and AV nodes. So we'll increase the rate of firing. Now, one of the things that we said about the action potentials in our conduction system was that they had those really long absolute refractory periods because of that plateau. So there was this generation of tension that happened so that we could generate our tension but then fully relax and keep the sodium channel absolutely refractory that whole time. But there was a relative refractory period here. So that's what we're taking advantage of here, is we're just going to increase the firing at the SA and AV nodes. What else? Okay. So the cardioacceleratory system is going to be the sympathetic nervous system, increasing our heart rate at the SA and AV nodes. The cardioinhibitory system is going to be controlled by which branch? The parasympathetic division. And now it's not like you're sitting there at rest right now at home, you know, eating your popcorn and watching your highly entertaining anatomy and physiology movie and just like sitting there at rest and you need to drop your heart rate even lower than that. That's not really what's going on here. Instead, what happens is that if a burglar had come in, your heart would still be racing. So, bad example. Okay, so if you thought a burglar had come in but you were wrong, it was just your roommate who is dressed as a burglar for quarantine entertainment, and you realize this, then your heart rate is going to need to come back down. And that's going to happen through output coming from your cardioinhibitory system, originating in medulla oblongata, then sending commands out through your vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is going to be able to drop your heart rate at your SA and AV nodes. I think the worst part about that story I just told you is that my roommate walked in time just to hear the suggestion. But he's going to be quiet about it in the kitchen because I'm lecturing. Okay, so the cardioinhibitory system then can correct after an increase in heart rate. The medulla oblongata will send out commands that are going to be executed through your vagus nerve to decrease heart rate at the SA and AV node. So we'll talk more about factors affecting what's called your cardiac output in a little bit. So the heart sets its own pace, but your brain, your autonomic nervous system can take over. Cardioacceleratory system, sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate at the SA and AV nodes. Cardioinhibitory system, your parasympathetic nervous system decreases your heart rate at your SA and AV nodes. Okay. So let's quickly review. You're sitting at home and you're like, lady, this is not a review for me. I'm watching the same video and you just got done talking about this stuff. It's a review for me because obviously it's a different day. Okay? So, depolarization. The reviews help. You need to see this 7 times to become an expert. So we're going to review the depolarization in our autorhythmic cells so that we can see how it relates to the depolarization in our contractile cells, and then what that is going to do to the force in our myocardium. So, if you recall, in our nodal cells, so first we're going to do our autorhythmic cells here. What's their resting membrane potential? -60. You got it. Okay, so they're sitting here at -60 millivolts, and the slow trickle voltage gated sodium channel is open. Sodium is trickling in, causing our pacemaker potential. And at -40 millivolts, what happens? The voltage gated calcium channel opens and depolarizes our cell to 0 millivolts. This 0 millivolts is what I want to talk about, really. But let's finish off our thought that our voltage gated potassium channel is going to take over and repolarize these cells. Oh, when we repolarize, what's going to happen? Our pacemaker maker potential is going to start again, and we'll start again. So this action potential is going to be conducted down those intrinsic conduction system cells. It's also going to be conducted through the atrial myocardium and then through the ventricular myocardium. So this depolarization that's going to happen in our contractile cells is coming from this 0 millivolts. That's the other thing that's going on here. So let's just draw up the graph for these babies. Their resting membrane potential is what? Does anybody remember? Negative 90 millivolts. Just like our skeletal muscle. So they're just sitting here at rest at negative 90 millivolts. And there's no kind of summation at all. What happens is that this 0 millivolts is going to open our voltage-gated sodium channels. What was the threshold for those bad boys? Negative 55 millivolts, right? Well, 0 is a lot, well, 0 is a lot higher than negative 55, so we'll definitely open them up. So we open and they stay open until what? Positive 30 millivolts. Okay, and then what happens in these cells? Does anybody remember? They have that plateau due to that slow voltage-gated calcium channel. And then our voltage-gated potassium channel is going to take over and we'll return to rest. So, depolarization, we could say, is due to the opening of our voltage-gated sodium channels in response to the 0 millivolts from our autorhythmic cells, which are these bad boys over there. Okay, all right, so plateau, the plateau. When we get up here to positive 30 millivolts, what happens to the voltage-gated sodium channel? It closes and inactivates. But these slow voltage-gated calcium channels are open, so calcium is going to come into the cell and keep it depolarized for a while. And then after a few milliseconds, they're going to close. Our voltage-gated potassium channels are going to take over and will be polarized. So words, if we wanted to write words, we've got our words for depolarization, our words for plateau. Slow voltage-gated calcium channels open. Calcium enters the cell, and this calcium is going to do a couple things. It's going to cause this plateau, but it's also going to help with the cross-bridge cycle. So if you recall, cardiac muscle tissue is striated, which means that the unit of contraction is the sarcomere. So in order to have cross-bridge cycling, we have to have calcium bind to troponin to move the tropomyosin complex so that we can have myosin grab on and do the cross-bridge cycle. So this calcium is going to cause this plateau, which is going to keep us depolarized longer so that this voltage-gated sodium channel stays inactive for longer, is absolutely refractory for a long time, and it's also going to, we'll say this increased calcium is needed for cross-bridge cycling. Okay, good deal. So that's the depolarization, and then the repolarization is coming back to rest, and that's just always due to our voltage-gated potassium channel, which opens at threshold of negative 55, but you can't see the effects of potassium, which is a positive ion, leaving the cell. You can't see the effects of a positive ion leaving the cell while you've got all these positive ions dumping into the cell. So you can't really see the effects of that until these channels close. So that's what it looks like in words and in graph. And why it's important then is because what's going to happen is calcium levels start increasing. So now I'm going to draw tension. So far we've been looking at millivolts on our y-axis, and this is time, and now we're looking at tension. And as calcium starts to go up inside the cell, because this depolarizing is going to be opening our sarcoplasmic reticulum in the cells, but also because we're going to be opening these channels, then as calcium is going to be going up, we're going to be increasing our tension. And so now what does that mean? This is the tension that we see in the atrial myocardiocytes, and then the tension that we would see in the ventricular myocardiocytes. And so they're going to contract, but then we have to relax. If we don't relax, we're in trouble. That's why we have this plateau. So that I might not have the appropriate exact line here, so you have to forgive me. I'm tired, and it's the coronavirus classroom. So I'm dropping off and relaxing, and as that happens then, I can make sure that I fully allow blood from the atria into the ventricles, and then the ventricles are going to contract, and then they're going to relax, and so that I can continuously pump blood. So it's critical that I have relaxation. So if you look in your book, it shows you the absolute refractory period is really long. And it's kind of like all this time that the sodium channel is open. If it's already open, we can't open it more. But all the way till when it resets. So it usually resets around about rest. So all during this time, we would be like absolutely refractory. And we couldn't stimulate that channel to open again. Now during this time, we would be in our relative refractory phase. Again, this is looking too long now that I'm drawing it out. So look in your book, there's a graph that shows it better. But during this time, if we want to, we could make your heart rate increase. And if we wanted to, that would be like through sympathetic nervous system activation, if we wanted to naturally. You can also do things like, take stimulants to increase heart rate. We'll talk about that at the end of the lecture when we talk about other factors in affecting cardiac output. Okay, why does all of this matter? Well, these action potentials in the conduction system are going to cause these action potentials in our contractile cells. These action potentials in our contractile cells are going to cause this kind of tension so that we can contract and move blood. So it's going to lead to these physical events in the heart, mechanical events in the heart. What's actually physically happening in the myocardium as this tension rises and falls. And so the period of contraction of myocardiocytes, or of either your atrial myocardium or ventricular myocardium, is systole. So systole is a period of contraction. And a period of relaxation is diastole. So diastole, this is a period of relaxation. So you've probably heard of your systolic and your diastolic blood pressures, the high number over the low number. And your systolic blood pressure is the pressure on your arteries when your ventricles, your pumping chambers, are in systole. So when they're contracting. And then you relax. And your diastolic blood pressure is the pressure on your blood vessels when your ventricles relax. And that number kind of gives you an idea about the elasticity of your arteries. If you recall, we said that elastic connective tissue had elasticity, the ability to stretch and recoil. And it's really abundant in the great arteries of the heart because it needs to be able to recoil so that during ventricular diastole, you don't lose blood pressure and pass out. Instead, the elasticity of your arteries squeezes back on that blood and you're able to maintain blood pressure. So if you've got a blood pressure 104 over 70, then that's how many millimeters of mercury would be pushed up by your blood when your ventricles are contracting and when they're relaxing. You also, though, have atrial contraction and relaxation. So there's atrial and diastole as well, but your blood pressure is just measuring what's happening due to your ventricles contracting. Okay, so what are the mechanical events of the heart? This is everything that's going to happen in the heart in one heartbeat. And so all of the systolic events and all of the diastolic events that happen in one heartbeat. So the cardiac cycle, all of the events of one heartbeat are all mechanical events in one heartbeat. And thinking about it, we can then think about what's happening in each chamber, what's happening with each of our valves. So when you are contracting, this cardiac cycle, what it looks like is this. So first your atria contract, and then they begin to relax. And as they begin to relax, your ventricles begin to contract. And so then they contract and your atria fully relax, and then they relax, and then for a brief moment all 4 chambers are relaxed. So your heartbeat looks something like that. So, okay, what's going on during all that time? Well, we've got atrial systole, and then atrial diastole begins as ventricular systole begins, then ventricular systole finishes, and then ventricular diastole begins. And then we start all over. What's happening with blood through each of these phases? So different books break these phases down into different names, but we always have ventricular filling, then we have ventricular systole, then we have the end isovolumetric relaxation when all 4 chambers are in diastole. So what's going on and what are some other names? How can we look at this? I think all books have kind of all names in there somewhere. But what's going on? So first we're starting with what's called ventricular filling. This is the period of time during which the ventricles are filling. And there are 2 kind of phases to this. There's our slow kind of passive filling, which is how 80% of the blood that's going to get to the ventricles gets to them. And then we've got rapid filling, which is when the atria do a quick little contraction, they have a little period of systole, squeeze the remaining 20% through, and then they go into diastole and begin our next phase. So each part kind of has 2 parts. So in ventricular filling, what happens is in our first part we could say we've got slow or passive filling when our atria are relaxed, our ventricles are relaxed, the AV valves are open because enough blood has returned to the heart that pushed them open, and our, what else? And our semilunar valves are still closed. So during ventricular filling, we've got our kind of slow filling, and during this time, our atria are in diastole. We'll say about 80% of blood passively flows through to the ventricles. I should probably just quit while I'm ahead and stop. I'm so tired. This is not working. And then we have rapid ventricular filling, and what happens here is our atria enter systole. They contract and squeeze the remaining 20% through. Through what? Through the AV valve. So here, which AV valve is on the right side? Tricuspid. Which AV valve is on the left side? Bicuspid. That was a test. Okay. So during this time, what we could think about now, if we're looking at the state of our valves, is our AV valves are open, but our semilunar valves are closed. Our AV valves have to be open because during ventricular filling, we're filling blood, taking blood from the atria, which we said were our receiving chambers, and getting it to our pumping chambers, the ventricles. Now, this next part, ventricular systole, when the ventricles enter systole, can also happen can be broken into 2 phases. So let's just think about what happened. At the end of our last heartbeat, all 4 chambers were relaxed. We're about to get there. So then, like 80% of our blood's returning to the heart, it opens up the AV valves, 80% of our blood flows into the ventricles, then the atria contract, squeeze our remaining 20% through, and as they begin relaxing, the ventricles begin contracting. So you often see this called isovolumetric contraction. So that is the first part of ventricular systole. And what happens now, when we get to the apex of the heart and contract it, it pulls on those papillary muscles that are there. I don't know if you remember from last lecture, there were words going past on the screen that said, oh, I forgot all of this to talk about it, I'm going to test you on it. hopefully you were watching and reading that. One of the things that I forgot to talk about was those papillary muscles. So down in the apex of the heart, on the inside of our ventricles, we have these papillary muscles that are anchored to these structures called chordae tendineae. So the papillary muscles are sticking up in here. These are the chordae tendineae, and they're attached to our AV valves. So what happens when our ventricles begin contracting down here, they pull on these papillary muscles and snap these AV valves shut. That's the first heart sound, of the lubbed up. That's the lubbed sound you hear. And so these snap shut. Why? Because we need to prevent blood from going back into the atria when my ventricles finish contracting. We need the blood to go up and out through my semilunar valves and get out of the heart and out to the pulmonary circuit and out to the systemic circuit. So there are kind of two phases to this also. Like the first phase is what some books, a lot of books will call our isovolumetric contraction. And during that time, our atria enter diastole and our ventricles begin systole. That is my foot, not a fart. Don't you laugh in there. The atria enter diastole and the ventricles begin systole. So this is important here because when the ventricles begin systole, my papillary muscles contract. And pull on my chordae tendineae. This snaps my AV valve shut, and that's my first heart sound. Not my fist, my first heart sound. Okay. Then what happens? Well, then my ventricles are going to finish systole. So the other, like the second part of ventricular systole is ventricular ejection. So during ventricular ejection, the pressure now in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. The semilunar valves blow open and blood exits the heart. So during ventricular ejection, we could say the ventricles complete systole. The pressure exceeds the pressure in the great arteries. The semilunar valves blow open and blood is ejected from the heart. So here we had ventricular filling, and then we have isovolumetric contraction, and then we have ventricular ejection. And then we have isovolumetric relaxation. When the ventricles then enter diastole, the pressure in the arteries is going to exceed that in the ventricles and snap the semilunar valve shut, your second heart sound. And now, for just a brief moment, all four chambers are relaxed, all four valves are closed, and then venous return to the atria is going to exceed the pressure in the AV valves. They'll open, blood will passively flow back through, and we'll begin again. But to finish out a definition for our isovolumetric relaxation, what we could say is that the ventricles enter diastole. The pressure of blood in the arteries snaps the semilunar valves closed. And so for a brief moment in time, all four chambers are closed, are relaxed, and all four valves are closed. But again, venous return to the heart is going to exceed the pressure of the AV valves. They'll open. 80% of blood is going to passively flow from the atria into the ventricles. Then they're going to contract, squeeze the rest through. Then our ventricles are going to contract, and it happens over and over and over again. Alright, so why do we care about all of this? Well, we're trying to get to the heart pumping blood to your tissues. So we're trying to get to cardiac output. And we measure cardiac output as your heart rate times what's called your stroke volume. So what is cardiac output? It's the amount of blood pumped through one ventricle in 1 minute. Oh my goodness, 1 ventricle, 1 minute. And we measure that by looking at our heart rate and our stroke volume. So heart rate's pretty obvious. This is measured in beats per minute. Stroke volume is how much blood you are pumping per beat. So every time your ventricle contracts, how much blood is squeezing out of it. So we look at that as a measurement of milliliters per beat. And at rest, most people's cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute, which is almost your entire blood volume. So at rest, almost your entire blood volume goes through your heart. So about 5 liters per minute is your resting cardiac output. Now there are times when we need more blood out in the system. Like if we're exercising, we need more blood flow. We need nutrient and gas exchange to be happening in our muscles really quickly. So we need to be able to get blood flowing through the system so that that can occur. And so your maximal cardiac output is how much blood you can pump when you're like at your max. And the difference between the two is like what you have in reserve. So how much could you ask your heart to do? I'm not going to have you calculate any of this stuff, just be aware of it. I am going to tell you that some of our trained, like really well-trained athletes can pump their entire blood volume through their body like 7 times in 1 minute. So the maximal cardiac output you see is around 35 liters per minute, which is pretty awesome. And the difference between your maximal and your rest is your cardiac reserve, or the reserve capacity you have in your heart. So this would be like your max minus your resting cardiac output. How can we change cardiac output? By changing our heart rate or our stroke volume. So how can we change stroke volume and heart rate? Okay, so if we look at what is stroke volume, this is the blood pumped out of a ventricle. So we find that by looking at what is there at the end of ventricular diastole and then subtracting what is ejected during ventricular systole. So the EDV is my end diastolic volume.
Mama, which one do you want me to get?
The heart. ESV is my end systolic.
Which one of these things is the hardest?
So if I look at this, how much is at the end of ventricular diastole and how much is at the end of ventricular systole, then that gives me my stroke volume. So if you look on a graph with the amount of blood in our ventricles, the most blood that it's going to have is at the end of atrial systole, when it squeezes in that last remaining 20%. So if we look here, this is our end diastolic volume, when my atria contract and squeeze that remaining 20% through. And then they're going to contract and squeeze out all this blood. And at the end of systole, I still have a little bit of blood left in my heart. And so that's my end systolic volume. So if I change either of these things, I can change my stroke volume. Okay, so what are ways that I can change stroke volume? I can change how much blood is coming back to my heart, and I can change how much blood I'm pumping out of my heart. So preload is how much blood is coming back to the heart. And if you remember, there's like an ideal length tension relationship much skeletal muscle can contract. There's also an ideal length-tension relationship. There's like Frank Starling while the heart is talking about this and all that's going on in this. Go pee. And I'm not going to make you worry about Frank Starling while the heart. What I want you to know and understand is what preload does to stroke volume. So if more blood is returned to your heart, it's going to stretch your heart more. But as more blood is returned, then your ventricles can contract and squeeze more out. So if you get more blood back to the ventricles, you're preloading the system. So they stretch and have more blood in them, and they can squeeze more out. So if they have more blood in them, what do you think that does to stroke volume? I just told you, they can squeeze more out. It increases stroke volume. So preload is the amount of blood, we could say returning to the ventricles or returning to the heart. And if it increases, it's going to increase stroke volume. Because if we have more blood in the heart, it's going to help with this length-tension relationship, but then we have more that we can squeeze out as well. So an increase in preload is going to lead to an increase in stroke volume. And we can do this by like increasing venous return. Well, what does this mean to you? We haven't really talked about blood vessels yet and the forces acting on the blood in different vessels. But when the ventricles contract, they squeeze all that blood through your arteries and it gets out to your tissues. And then when you get to your tissues, you're in capillary beds. And when you get to the capillary beds, you pretty much disperse all of that pressure from your ventricles contracting. So that by the time I'm in veins, the pressure moving blood through veins is different. It's my skeletal muscle pump or my respiratory pump. Gravity can also help or hinder, depending on which body part you're looking at and where you're at. So all those things are going to be changing. So if all of a sudden I'm squeezing my muscles more, then I'm squeezing more venous blood in my veins and it's going to return to the heart. So then I increase my preload, I increase the amount of blood back to the heart, and then I can squeeze harder and increase my stroke volume. The next thing that I can do is I can change my contractility, or the force with which, Theseus, I cannot right now. I need like 5 more minutes. So if I increase the force with which my myocardiocytes contract, then I can also squeeze more blood out and change my stroke volume. So this is how the sympathetic nervous system is actually going to be able to have an impact on cardiac output, is by increasing contractility. So if I increase the strength of contraction, I can increase the amount of blood that I push out of the heart. Okay. The last thing is going to be kind of hard to change on a moment-to-moment basis. This is afterload. This is how much resistance there is to blood flow. And if we look at afterload and its effects on stroke volume, let's just imagine that you're little Theseus here, and you have these nice, clean blood vessels. And then your mom lets you eat McDonald's French fries once a week, so you start building up. I wonder if it's happened to him. I hope not. I'm feeling guilty. Maybe no more McDonald's French fries. But over his life, if he continues eating McDonald's French fries like his mother has, then he'll start building up these atherosclerotic plaques and increasing his afterload. So as you increase afterload, what do you think that does to stroke volume? How much blood your heart can pump out. If there's more resistance out here, I can pump out less. So an increase in afterload is going to decrease my stroke volume. Okay, so it's me whose arteries look like this, and I go to the doctor and they give me statins, or I start eating better and I eat good healthy plant fats and I get rid of these atherosclerotic plaques, then I would decrease my afterload. This is something that's not easy to change on a moment-to-moment basis. Okay, preload's pretty easy to change because all we have to do is increase our venous return. Contractility, it depends if you have epinephrine on board. So let's just think about each of these things. If I have an increase in preload, I have an increase in blood back to the heart, I can get an increase in blood out of the heart, I increase my stroke volume. If I have an increase in contractility, I have an increased pressure that I'm ejecting blood from the heart, I'll increase my stroke volume. If I have an increase in afterload, that's an increase in resistance to blood flow. So this is actually going to decrease my stroke volume. All right, what about decreases? If I get a decrease in venous return to the heart, then I would get a decrease in stroke volume. Less blood back, less blood to pump out. If I have a decrease in my force of contraction, then I'm going to decrease the blood I pump out, which would decrease my stroke volume. If I have a decrease in afterload, this is going to have the inverse effect. If I have a decrease in afterload, then I get less resistance, so I would increase my stroke volume. All right. So how can we change heart rate? How can we change? We just talked about how we can change stroke volume. I don't know. It doesn't seem as easy to me to change stroke volume as it is to change heart rate. It's pretty easy to change heart rate. If we think about our autonomic nervous system, talked about this a little bit, the cardioacceleratory system is going to be able to increase heart rate. So for autonomic nervous regulation, we could say our sympathetic nervous system is going to increase heart rate by increasing firing at the SA and AV nodes. For a decrease in heart rate, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to, after an increase due to sympathetic nervous system activation or something like that, after an increase, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick on board, and it's going to decrease your heart rate by decreasing the firing at the SA and AV nodes. So that's how the autonomic nervous system is going to interact with our heart rate. Let me just point out again that on this contractility feature back here, changes in stroke volume, this parasympathetic nervous division did not have an effect on this. So the increase in contractility is happening due to sympathetic nervous system activation. So the sympathetic nervous system activation can increase heart rate, but it can also increase contractility. The parasympathetic nervous system does not decrease contractility, it only decreases heart rate. So just be aware of that. Okay, let's see, what else? There's a negative feedback loop here that could happen. Okay, so changes in heart rate, things that can change heart rate other than your autonomic nervous system. So chemicals, exogenous chemicals could change your heart rate. Thyroxine, which is in your body, could change your heart rate. So what do you think thyroid hormones would do to your heart rate? They would increase your heart rate because they increase metabolic rate, right? So that's something. So autonomic nervous system regulation. This would be the sympathetic nervous system using norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter. As a chemical, epinephrine coming from the adrenal medulla would also increase our heart rate. And this is going to act synergistically with the sympathetic nervous system to amplify above and beyond what you would see just due to sympathetic nervous system activation. So that's another chemical that could have an effect. Caffeine is going to increase your heart rate. Methamphetamines, cocaine, all stimulants would all increase your heart rate. That's a whole big cerebral thing we're not going to go into right now. What else? What else? We're almost done. Other factors, age, heart rate increases with age, gender. Males have a higher heart rate, higher resting heart rate than females. We're done. Thank you. This has been cardiovascular system, the heart. See you next time for blood vessels. Hey, I love my coronavirus classroom, and I'm so thankful for my big whiteboard. Okay. Oh, coronavirus classroom. Take 20 million! Can you see that? I don't know. You can pause and rewind. What does it say? That's what it says. Pause and rewind is what it says. That's what she said! Okay. This is
hours. I'm leaving it this time, people.